Light beyond darkness, a beginning in the dark, under the skies of Bethlehem, a brilliant star appeared, floating like an eternal flame, lighting up the barren land of Judea. This was the first sign, a whisper from the heavens that something great was about to happen. In a small stable, amidst the smell of hay and the breath of animals, Mary, a young girl from Nazareth, held her newborn child tightly in her arms. Her hands trembled from the cold and fatigue after a long journey, but her eyes sparkled with joy and amazement. Beside her, Joseph, the humble carpenter, stood silently, his calloused hands tightly gripping a staff, his heart filled with both pride and worry. The child was named Jesus. A simple name, but one with deep meaning, the Savior. He lay in a manger, wrapped in rough cloth, his eyes half closed but seemingly able to see the whole world. Outside the stable, shepherds, poor, despised by society, gathered, their faces bright after hearing the heavenly song, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to those of good will." They knelt, offering simple gifts, a woolen garment, a handful of goat's milk, and sincere reverence. Farther away, from the east, 3 wise men, those who studied the stars, rode camels across the desert, bringing gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They had seen the star months earlier, and their intuition told them that a great king had been born. When they arrived at the stable, they bowed before the child, offering their gifts, but in their hearts, a question arose: how can a king be born in such a humble place? They did not know that this king had not come to sit on a throne, but to bring light into the darkness. In Jerusalem, King Herod heard the news from the wise men, his heart troubled. He summoned the priests and scribes, asking, "Where will the Messiah be born?" They replied, "In Bethlehem, as foretold by the prophet Micah." Herod scoffed, but his eyes gleamed with malice. He secretly ordered, "Find the child and kill him." Beneath his calm exterior, a storm was brewing, ready to sweep away any threat to his throne. In the stable, Jesus slept peacefully, unaware of the plots unfolding. Mary and Joseph sensed an unease, but they trusted the words of the angel Gabriel. "This child is the Son of the Most High." That night, the star continued to shine, like a lighthouse guiding those who sought the truth. And the greatest story of humanity began, fleeing under the star's light. After the wise men departed, the shadow of Herod began to fall over Bethlehem. In a dream, an angel appeared to Joseph, speaking urgently, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt tonight, for Herod is seeking to kill him." Joseph woke up with a start, sweat running down his forehead. He looked at Mary, who was holding Jesus as she slept soundly, and his heart ached, but he did not hesitate. "Mary, we must go," he whispered urgently. Mary nodded without asking many questions. She wrapped Jesus more tightly in cloth and held him in her arms, while Joseph hastily packed their belongings onto the old donkey. They left the stable under the faint moonlight, carrying only a few loaves of dry bread and a water skin. The road to Egypt stretched hundreds of kilometers, through burning desert sands and rugged hills, but they had no other choice. The star still hung in the sky, a reminder that they were not alone. In Bethlehem, Herod's soldiers stormed in, their sharp swords gleaming in the night. The cries of mothers echoed as they killed all the children under 2, the blood staining the narrow alleys. Herod sat in his palace, satisfied, no more threat. But he did not know that the child he sought had escaped his sword, protected by an invisible hand from the heavens. In Egypt, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus found refuge in a small village by the Nile River. Joseph worked as a carpenter, his hands growing calloused again as he sawed wood under the intense sun. Mary cared for Jesus, singing lullabies to him in the songs of the Jewish people. Jesus grew up among the Egyptian children, playing by the river. but his eyes always held a strange light, as if he knew he did not belong there. Years passed until Herod died in pain and chaos, his throne contested by his sons. Another angel appeared to Joseph in a dream, "Return to Israel, for the one who sought the child's life is dead." Joseph woke up, shared the news with Mary, and they prepared for the journey back. Jesus, now a boy, held his mother's hand as they began the long road back to Nazareth, where he would grow up quietly, awaiting his time. Return to Nazareth. The journey from Egypt to Nazareth was no easier than the one they had taken before. Joseph led the way, his staff tapping rhythmically on the dry, barren road. Mary held Jesus close to her chest, her legs weary but without complaint. They passed through desolate fields, through villages ravaged by war under Herod's reign. When they reached the border of Judea, they heard the news that Archelaus, Herod's son, had succeeded his father, just as cruel. Joseph grew anxious, but another dream led them to Galilee, to Nazareth, where they had once lived before fleeing. Nazareth was a small town, nestled between green hills, where the people lived by farming and raising livestock. Joseph reopened his carpentry workshop, with the sound of saws and hammers echoing every day. Mary wove fabric, took care of their small stone house, and taught Jesus the first prayers from the Torah. Jesus grew up like every other child in the village, running through the hills, playing with friends, but he was different. His eyes were deep, as if they contained the whole sky, and his words, though still young, carried a strange power. One day, when Jesus was about 5 years old, he followed Joseph to a field near their home. A small sparrow had fallen from its nest, its weak wings unable to fly. Jesus bent down, picked it up, whispered something, and then released it. The bird flapped its wings and soared into the sky before Joseph's astonished eyes. "How did you do that?" Joseph asked, his voice trembling. Jesus smiled, "My Father in heaven loves all creatures, Father." Joseph did not ask more, but he knew this child was not just his son. Mary also noticed the signs. When Jesus played with the village children, he often told strange stories about the kingdom of heaven, making the children sit quietly, captivated. One time, when a storm hit Nazareth, Jesus stood before the door, raised his small hand, and the wind suddenly stopped, the clouds parted. Mary knelt beside him, whispering, "Who are you, my son?" Jesus embraced her, "I am the Father's, and I am yours." At the temple in Jerusalem, when Jesus was 12 years old, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem for the Passover feast, a Jewish tradition. The long journey took them through dusty roads under the scorching sun of Judea. Jerusalem appeared before them, magnificent with its white stone walls and golden temple domes. The crowd was dense, with prayers mingling with the sounds of livestock being brought for sacrifice. Jesus walked beside his parents, his eyes lighting up as he gazed at the holy city, not for its beauty, but because he sensed his destiny. After the feast, Joseph and Mary joined the group of people returning home, thinking Jesus was with them. But when they reached the rest stop, they realized he was not with them. Mary panicked, "Joseph, where is he?" They turned back to Jerusalem, searching for him for 3 days, their hearts full of worry. Finally, they found him in the temple courtyard, sitting among the teachers of the law, older men with white beards, debating the scriptures. Jesus asked questions and answered with wisdom far beyond his 12 years, leaving the teachers astonished. "Where did this child get such deep understanding?" one of them whispered. Mary rushed to him. "Son, why have you caused us to worry?" Jesus looked up with a calm gaze. "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know I must be in my Father's house?" Mary and Joseph did not fully understand, but they took him home, their hearts filled with both joy and confusion. On the way back to Nazareth, Jesus was silent, but in his heart, a fire had been kindled, a fire that would blaze when his time came. The silent years before the storm, after the event at the Jerusalem temple, Jesus returned to Nazareth and continued to grow in silence. The years of childhood gradually gave way to adulthood. And he became a tall man, with broad shoulders from carpentry work and calloused hands from holding saws and chisels. His dark hair grew longer, sometimes tied with a rough cloth, and his deep eyes still carried a strange light, the same light that Mary and Joseph had seen when he lay in the manger. The people of Nazareth knew him, calling him Jesus, the son of Joseph, but no one knew that beneath his humble exterior, a great power was silently growing. Joseph was now old, his hair streaked with gray, and his once strong hands began to tremble when he held tools. He taught Jesus every skill he knew: how to measure wood, how to join dovetails, how to create tables that would endure over time. But Jesus did not just learn from his Father. He often sat alone after work, under the shade of an olive tree on the hill, reading the Torah or simply gazing out at the Galilean valley. Sometimes, Mary would see him whispering to himself, as if talking to someone she could not see. "Who are you speaking to?" she once asked. Jesus smiled and answered, "To my Father, Mother." Mary did not ask more, but her heart trembled with a feeling that was both tender and painful. During these years, Jesus lived like an ordinary man. He worked in the carpentry shop, helped neighbors repair their houses, and attended prayers at the synagogue with the villagers. But even in his simplicity, strange signs began to appear. Once, when he was 20 years old, a neighbor brought a piece of rotting wood to the workshop, hoping Joseph could salvage something from it. Joseph shook his head, but Jesus stepped forward, placed his hand on the wood, and to everyone's astonishment, the rotting part disappeared, leaving a solid piece of wood, fragrant with fresh resin. "How did you do that?" the neighbor asked, his voice trembling. Jesus simply smiled. Good wood should not be wasted. Mary and Joseph had grown accustomed to these small miracles, but they still urged him to keep them hidden. The villagers began to whisper, "Jesus has strange skills," they said, but no one dared think further. To them, he was just a kind carpenter, a dutiful son, a gentle friend. But within Jesus, a fire smoldered. He felt the call, not from men, but from somewhere deeper, a place he called Father. When Jesus reached the age of 30, life in Nazareth remained peaceful, but the atmosphere in the Galilee region began to change. Rumors spread from the plains near the Jordan River. A strange man, dressed in camel's hair and eating locusts with wild honey, was preaching by the riverbank. His name was John, the son of Zechariah and Elizabeth, relatives of Mary. He was called John the Baptist because he called people to repent and be baptized in water to prepare for something great that was about to come. Mary heard about John from the traders passing through the village. She remembered the day Elizabeth was pregnant with John, a miracle in itself, since Elizabeth was old and had lost hope of bearing a child. Mary had visited Elizabeth, and at that moment, John in her womb leaped with joy when Mary, pregnant with Jesus, entered the house. "Who is this, that my child knows him?" Mary wondered, and now, hearing about John, she felt a strange energy pass through her. She looked at Jesus, sitting under the olive tree, and whispered to Joseph, "Perhaps the time has come." Jesus also heard about John. One evening, while sitting with his family, a neighbor told them, "John says that someone greater than him is coming, someone who will baptize with the Holy Spirit and fire." Jesus didn't respond, only silently nodded, but his eyes lit up, as if a final piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. From that day, he often left the village early in the morning, walking to distant hills where he would kneel and pray. Mary saw him return with a calm yet resolute expression, as though he were preparing to enter a battle. One day, when Jesus was 30 years old, he stood before Mary and Joseph in their small house. "I must go," he said, his voice deep but certain. Mary was startled, her hands trembling. "Where will you go, my son?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "To the Jordan River," Jesus replied. "I must meet John." Joseph looked at him, his eyes dimmed with age but still shining with faith. "Are you ready?" he asked. Jesus smiled, placing his hand on his parents' shoulders. "My Father in heaven has prepared me long ago." On the day he left Nazareth, the sky over Galilee was unusually clear. Jesus walked, carrying nothing but his rough cloak and worn sandals. Mary stood at the door of their house, watching his figure fade behind the hills, tears streaming down her face. Joseph embraced her, whispering, "He no longer belongs to us." But in their hearts, they knew that this departure was not the end, but the beginning of something great. In Jerusalem, Archelaus still ruled with brutality. But he began to hear rumors about John the Baptist. A madman preaching at the Jordan River, he roared at his guards. "Keep an eye on him. If he causes trouble, kill him." But Archelaus did not know that John was merely the forerunner, and the one whom John proclaimed would soon shake all of Judea. Under the sky of Nazareth, Jesus walked, each step firm on the dirt road. He did not look back, but in his heart, a song echoed, the song of salvation, of light, of love for humanity. The years of silence had passed, and the storm was about to come. Baptism by the Jordan River. The road from Nazareth to the Jordan River was a long journey through golden wheat fields and the dry hills of Galilee. Jesus walked alone, his worn sandals brushing against the dusty earth, his rough cloak fluttering in the wind. He was 30 years old, but his face carried a timeless calm, as though he had lived through centuries. In his heart, a powerful call echoed, not from men, but from his Father in heaven, the one he had conversed with during his hours of prayer under the olive trees in Nazareth. He knew the time had come, the time when the years of silence would give way to the light. The Jordan River appeared before him on an early morning, as the dawn light shimmered on the water. The river was not wide, but deep and strong, flowing through the land filled with memories of the people of Israel, where the patriarch Abraham had once set foot, where the people crossed to enter the promised land. On the riverbank, a crowd gathered, their voices blending with the sound of the flowing water. In the center of the crowd stood John the Baptist, a tall, gaunt man with messy hair and a long beard. He wore camel's hair, a leather belt around his waist, and his eyes burned like fire as he preached, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. One greater than I is coming. I am not worthy to carry his sandals." Jesus stood among the crowd, watching John. He recognized him, not only because they were relatives through Mary and Elizabeth, but because of a deeper bond, a destiny that had connected them long before their births. As John immersed each person in the water, washing away their sins, Jesus stepped forward, his feet leaving light marks on the sandy shore. The crowd did not notice, but John paused, his eyes wide as he saw him. A strange sensation passed through him, as if his soul had just recognized something he had never fully understood. "Who are you, that you come here?" John asked, his voice trembling, although he had already guessed the answer. Jesus smiled and placed his hand on John's shoulder. "I come to be baptized by you," he said, his voice deep and warm, but carrying an invisible authority. John stepped back, shaking his head. "I need to be baptized by you, not the other way around. I am a sinner, but you." He stopped, unable to finish, but his eyes shone with reverence. "Do as the Father wills," Jesus replied, his gaze unwavering. John no longer protested. He led Jesus down into the water, his hands trembling as he placed them on his shoulders. When John immersed Jesus in the river, time seemed to stand still. The water flowed over him, but it wasn't just water, it seemed to tremble, as if the very Jordan River was bowing before the one who entered its depths. When John lifted Jesus up, a miraculous phenomenon occurred. The sky suddenly opened, not literally, but as if an invisible veil had been torn apart. Brilliant white light poured down, shining directly on Jesus, causing the crowd to flinch and shield their eyes. From that light, a pure white dove appeared, hovering above his head, its wings radiating a cool, refreshing breeze. Then a voice rang out, not from John, not from anyone in the crowd, but from heaven itself. The voice was deep, powerful, yet gentle, like a father calling his son, "This is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased." The crowd knelt, some shouting in astonishment, others crying in fear. John collapsed onto the sandy shore, his eyes filled with tears as he looked at Jesus. "You are the one," he whispered. "I knew it, but now I see clearly." Jesus helped him to his feet, his gaze full of love. "You have done well, John," he said. "Now is the time for me to begin." But not everyone rejoiced. Among the crowd, a few Pharisees, lawyers from Jerusalem, stood at a distance, observing with suspicious eyes. They had come to see John, to assess whether he posed a threat to their power. But when they witnessed this scene, they whispered to each other, "Who is this man that the heavens open for him? How can a man from Nazareth be the one?" They did not believe. But a sense of unease began to creep into their hearts. The news of the baptism spread quickly, even reaching Archelaus in Judea. He scoffed when he heard his guards report, "A man from Nazareth is recognized by the heavens." Nonsense. But if he causes trouble, kill him along with John. Archelaus did not know that, in his arrogance, he was facing a power that his throne could not match. After the baptism, Jesus did not stay long at the Jordan River. He stepped onto the shore, his cloak soaked and clinging to him, but he did not shiver from the cold. He looked at John one last time, nodded as a silent promise, and then turned away. The crowd watched him, but no one dared follow. John stood there, watching his figure fade behind the hills, and in his heart, a joy mixed with sorrow swelled. He knew his mission was nearly over, but Jesus' mission had just begun. Jesus did not return to Nazareth immediately. He went into the desert, where the dust and burning heat tested every living creature. He knew that before bringing light to humanity, he had to face the darkness, not only outside, but also within. Under the vast sky, he walked, each step firm, preparing for the greatest challenge that no one, not even Mary or Joseph, could have imagined. In Nazareth, Mary stood at the door of their house, and a strange feeling suddenly rose within her. She didn't know what had just happened by the Jordan River, but she sensed it, just as any mother can feel her child. She knelt down, praying silently, "Father in heaven, please keep my son safe." The wind blew through, bringing with it a cool, refreshing breeze, as if a distant answer had come. The temptation in the desert. After being baptized by John at the Jordan River, Jesus did not return to Nazareth or remain among the bustling crowd. He walked, his firm steps leading him into the desert of Judea, a barren land, where the dust swirled and the rocks burned under the scorching sun. He carried no food, no water, only the rough cloak that had dried after his baptism and a will as strong as an unquenchable fire. In his heart, a voice echoed, the voice of his Father in heaven, who had just declared, "This is my beloved Son." But he knew, before bringing light to humanity, he must face the darkness. The desert stretched endlessly before him, with no trees, no streams. The wind blew through, carrying a hissing sound like the whispers of lost souls. Jesus walked through the day, then night, then another day, without resting, without eating. 40 days passed, his body weary, his lips cracked from thirst, but his gaze never wavered. He knelt in the hot sand, praying to his Father, and in that stillness, the darkness finally took shape. From nothingness, a figure appeared. It didn't have a clear form at first, only a swirl of pitch-black air, curling like smoke between the rocks. Then it gradually solidified, turning into a tall man with an unusually handsome yet cold face, his eyes glowing red like burning coals. He smiled, a smile both alluring and cruel, and stepped closer to Jesus. "You must be very hungry," he said, his voice smooth like honey but carrying the sharpness of a blade. "If you are truly the Son of God, why not turn these stones into bread and eat?" Jesus looked up, his eyes burning brightly despite his weakened body. He didn't respond immediately, just stared directly at Satan, the tempter, the one who had been waiting for this moment since Jesus was born in the Bethlehem manger. "Man does not live by bread alone," Jesus finally spoke, his voice deep but resonating across the desert, "but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Satan frowned, his smile stiffening. But he didn't give up. In the blink of an eye, the scene changed. Jesus found himself standing on the highest point of the temple in Jerusalem, the wind blowing through his cloak, the holy city sprawling beneath him. Satan stood beside him, arms outstretched like a king flaunting his domain. "If you are the Son of God," he said, his voice filled with challenge, "throw yourself down. Doesn't the scripture say that the angels will lift you up in their hands, so that your foot will not strike a stone?" He laughed loudly, as if he already knew the outcome. Jesus looked down, not with fear, but with absolute calm. "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test," he replied, his voice cutting through Satan's pride like a sword. Satan gritted his teeth, his red eyes flashing with anger, but he still didn't give up. The temptation in the desert. For the third time, the scene changed. Jesus stood on a towering mountain, higher than any peak on earth. Before him, the whole world appeared, magnificent kingdoms with golden palaces, cities glowing with lights, powerful armies bowing down. Satan stood beside him, arms spread wide to encompass the vision. "All of these belong to me," he said, his voice sweet but cold. "I will give them all to you if you bow down and worship me." Jesus looked at the scene, but his gaze remained unwavering. He turned to Satan, and this time, his voice not only sounded deep but carried an authority that made the desert tremble. "Get away from me, Satan. You shall worship the Lord your God, and serve only him." His words were like thunder, dispelling Satan's illusion. He screamed, a roar of anger echoing through the air, then vanished into thin air, leaving Jesus alone in the desert. As Satan disappeared, the strength of the darkness receded, and the desert returned to its quiet stillness. Jesus knelt, exhausted, but the light within him remained undiminished. Then, from the sky, angels appeared, not one, but dozens, with wings glowing brightly like flames. They descended, bringing cool water and heavenly bread, serving him as one would serve a king. Jesus ate and drank, his strength returning, but he did not hurry to leave. He sat there, under the scorching sun, praying to his Father, giving thanks for having overcome the trial. 40 days in the desert was not only a battle with Satan but also a time of preparation. Jesus knew that his enemy was not just the external darkness but the temptations within human hearts, hunger, pride, power. He had triumphed, not through physical strength, but through the word of his Father and an unwavering will. When he stood up, the desert seemed different. The wind no longer howled with malice but carried a new breath, the breath of hope. Jesus walked out of the wilderness, his steps more firm than ever. He did not return to Nazareth immediately, but headed toward Galilee, where his mission would begin. News of him had spread after his baptism at the Jordan River, and now, after his trial in the desert, he was ready to face the world. In Nazareth, Mary felt something stir in her heart. She didn't know exactly what had happened, but she knelt to pray, and a cool breeze blew through their small house, as if confirming that Jesus was safe. In Jerusalem, the Pharisees heard of a man emerging from the desert with strange power, and they whispered among themselves, "Who is he? A prophet, or a deceiver?" But Jesus paid no attention to the whispers of men. He walked on, carrying the light that had been forged in the darkness, ready for what awaited ahead: the disciples, the miracles, and ultimately, the cross, the chosen ones, after 40 days in the desert. Jesus emerged from the wilderness with a new strength, not the strength of muscles, but the strength of a soul refined through darkness. He did not return to Nazareth, where Mary and Joseph were waiting in silence, but instead turned toward the shores of Galilee, a land lush with wheat fields and a lake that sparkled under the sun. News of him had spread from the Jordan River, about the baptism, the sky opening, the voice from heaven, and now, as he appeared, the crowds began to gather, curious to see the man whom John the Baptist had called the Greater One. The Sea of Galilee stretched out before him, the waves gently lapping the shore, carrying the scent of fish and wildflowers. Along the shore, fishermen were working, mending nets, pulling in fish, shouting to each other amid laughter. Jesus stopped, his gaze sweeping over them, not with curiosity, but with a deep understanding, as though he had known them for a long time. Among them, 2 brothers stood out: Simon, a tall man with a thick beard and strong hands from years of hauling nets, and Andrew, his younger brother, smaller but quick, his eyes bright with curiosity. Simon cast the net into the water, sweat running down his forehead. The night before, he and Andrew had worked all night without catching a single fish. And now, he was frustrated, ready to give up. Jesus approached, standing on the sand, his voice rising, not loud, but cutting through the sound of the waves. "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." Simon turned, frowning at the stranger in the rough cloak. "We've worked all night and caught nothing," he replied harshly. "Who are you to tell us to do this?" Andrew placed his hand on his brother's shoulder and whispered, "Listen to him, Simon. There's something about him." Simon sighed, but at his brother's insistence, reluctantly obeyed. He and Andrew pushed the boat out, casting the net on the right side as Jesus had said. Immediately, the net filled, heavy with so many fish that they had to shout for help from others. The fish spilled over, glimmering in the sunlight, so many that the boat began to tip, almost capsizing. Simon fell to his knees on the sand, his eyes wide with amazement. "Depart from me," he said, his voice trembling. "I am a sinful man, unworthy of this." But Jesus stepped forward, placing his hand on Simon's shoulder, his gaze gentle but full of authority. "Do not be afraid," he said. "From now on, you will catch men." Simon looked up, not fully understanding, but in his heart, a fire ignited, the fire of faith, of calling. Andrew stood beside him, smiling, ready to follow this man without any further questions, the chosen ones. Jesus did not stop there. He continued walking along the shore, and soon he encountered James and John, 2 brothers, the sons of Zebedee, who were mending nets with their father on the boat. James, the hot-tempered one, was arguing with John about a hole in the net when Jesus approached. He didn't say much, only looked at them and called, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Zebedee, their father, looked up, about to protest, but the look in Jesus' eyes silenced him. James and John exchanged a glance, then without hesitation, they left the nets and stepped down from the boat, leaving their father stunned on the shore. The four, Simon, whom Jesus would later call Peter, Andrew, James, and John, became the first disciples. They were not scholars, not priests, just ordinary fishermen with calloused hands and simple lives. But Jesus saw something in them that they didn't see in themselves: faith, sincerity, and a potential that would change the world. They followed him, asking no questions, expecting nothing, simply drawn in by his voice and his gaze, a pull that was irresistible, like the moon drawing the tide. News of Jesus choosing disciples spread quickly across Galilee. The people whispered, "Who is he that these fishermen would leave everything to follow him? A prophet? Or a madman?" But for Peter, Andrew, James, and John, the question didn't matter. They felt that when they were with Jesus, they were no longer just fishermen, they were part of something greater, even though they didn't fully understand it. That day, when the sun set over the Sea of Galilee, Jesus led the 4 disciples up a nearby hill. He sat down, looked at them, and began to speak, not in the dry, lecture-like voice of the scribes, but with a liveliness that stirred their hearts. "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field," he said. "When a man finds it, he will sell everything he has to buy that field." Peter furrowed his brow, trying to understand, while John smiled, as if he had just grasped a secret. They sat there, under the blazing sky, listening to his words, and in their hearts, a seed had been planted. In Jerusalem, the Pharisees heard about Jesus and the fishermen following him. "A man from Nazareth gathering the common folk," one of them scoffed. "Who does he think he is?" But a few others fell silent, their eyes filled with concern. They remembered John the Baptist, remembered the baptism at the Jordan River, and a sense of unease crept into their hearts. In Nazareth, Mary sensed the change. Though Jesus had not returned, she heard news from travelers, about her son, about those following him, about the power in his words. She knelt to pray, both proud and fearful, knowing that the path he had chosen would not be easy. Under the sky of Galilee, Jesus walked, the 4 disciples following behind. He did not promise gold or silver, did not promise power, but they followed nonetheless, not for what he could give, but for who he was. And in that simplicity, an army of light began to form, ready to face the darkness that lurked ahead. The first miracle at Cana, after choosing the first 4 disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, Jesus led them through the dirt roads of Galilee, where the scent of dry grass mixed with the salty breeze from the sea. He wasn't in a hurry, not seeking attention, but each step he took seemed to carry a meaning that the disciples had yet to fully understand. They followed him, both curious and awestruck, occasionally whispering to each other, "What will he do next?" But Jesus only smiled, his gaze distant, as if seeing a future they couldn't yet touch. One day, when the sun hung high in the sky over Galilee, an invitation came to Jesus and his disciples. A wedding was being held in Cana, a small village not far from Nazareth. It was said to be the wedding of a poor but hospitable family, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, was also invited. Jesus led his disciples there, not as the honored guest, but as a simple friend among the crowd. When they arrived, the sounds of laughter echoed from the courtyard, the scent of baking bread and roasted meat filled the air, and the guests danced under the brilliant sunlight. Mary was there, standing among the other mothers, helping arrange the banquet tables. When she saw Jesus enter with his disciples, she smiled, her eyes both tender and proud. She hadn't seen him since he left Nazareth, but news of the baptism at the Jordan River and the people following him had reached her. "How are you, my son?" she asked softly. Jesus nodded, placing his hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, mother," he said, and in that moment, Mary felt that her son had changed, not just the carpenter from Nazareth anymore, but something greater. The wedding continued joyfully, but as the evening wore on, a problem arose. The wine, the essential part of a Galilean wedding, ran out. The steward, a middle-aged man with a red face from worry, hurried over to whisper to the bride and groom. The crowd didn't yet notice, but the atmosphere began to tense. Mary overheard the conversation, and with the instinct of a mother, she turned to Jesus, her eyes filled with quiet faith. "They have no more wine," she said, not as a plea, but as a subtle suggestion. Jesus looked at her, smiling gently. "Mother, my time has not yet come," he replied, his voice deep but not dismissive. Mary didn't say anything more. She turned to the servants nearby and whispered, "Do whatever he tells you." The disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, stood behind, curious and watching. They had not yet seen Jesus perform a miracle since the catch of fish on the Sea of Galilee, and now, they wondered what he would do in such a simple situation. The first miracle at Cana, Jesus stood up and walked over to the 6 large stone jars used for the Jewish ritual washing of hands. Each jar was nearly waist-high and could hold several dozen liters of water. He looked at them and then turned to the servants. "Fill the jars with water," he said, his voice calm as if giving an everyday instruction. The servants hesitated, but Jesus' gaze made them afraid to question him. They ran off, drawing water from a nearby well and filling each jar until it overflowed. When the jars were full, Jesus nodded. "Now, draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet," he said. The servants looked at each other, confused. The water in the jars was clearly well water. How could they serve it to the guests? But they obeyed, drawing a bowl of water from the first jar and bringing it to the master of the banquet. When he tasted it, his face changed, from worry to astonishment. "Wine," he shouted, his voice echoing across the courtyard. "This is the best wine I have ever tasted." The crowd buzzed. Laughter and congratulations filled the air once more. The master of the banquet ran over to the groom, clapping him on the back. "Everyone serves the best wine first, and then the cheaper wine when the guests have had too much to drink. But you've saved the best until now." The groom stood there, puzzled, not understanding what was happening, but smiled, letting everyone think it was his idea. The disciples stood silently, their eyes wide. Peter whispered to Andrew, "What did he do to the water?" Andrew shook his head, not answering, only looking at Jesus with growing reverence. James and John laughed, like children who had just witnessed a wondrous trick. But Jesus did not show off. He sat back down, continuing to talk with Mary, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. Mary looked at him, her eyes filled with both joy and concern. She knew this was the beginning, not only of miracles but of the path that would take Jesus out of the shadow of Nazareth, into the light and into greater darkness. "Your time has begun, hasn't it?" she silently asked in her heart, but did not speak aloud. News of the miracle spread quickly through Cana, and then to the surrounding villages. People whispered, "The men from Nazareth turned water into wine. Who is he?" A few Pharisees heard this from afar, frowning with doubt. "How can a man who does magic tricks be so famous?" they said. But for the disciples, the miracle at Cana was not just about wine. It was proof that the one they followed was no ordinary man. That evening, as the wedding feast came to an end, Jesus led his disciples out of Cana. Under the starry sky, he stopped and looked at them. "What did you see today?" he asked. Peter answered confidently, "You have power over both water and wine." Jesus smiled, saying nothing more, but in his heart, he knew that this miracle was just the beginning, a small sign of the greater things that awaited. in Nazareth, Mary heard news from travelers passing through. She knelt and prayed, "Father in heaven, please guide my son." The wind blew through, bringing with it a gentle warmth, as if a distant answer had come. The Sermon on the Mount. After the miracle at Cana, Jesus' fame spread quickly throughout Galilee like a breeze sweeping through wheat fields. People spoke not only of his words that were like a wind blowing through their souls, but also of the power in his hands, the power that had turned water into wine. The crowds began to gather around him, not only because of the miracles but because of his teachings, words unlike those of the scribes or Pharisees, words that had a vibrant power, reaching the hearts of men. Jesus, with his disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, traveled through the villages, and wherever he went, curious and hopeful eyes followed. One early morning, as the sun rose over the Sea of Galilee, Jesus led his disciples up a low hill near Capernaum. The hill was not as high as Sinai, where Moses had received the law, but it was high enough to overlook the lush valley and the sparkling lake. The crowd had heard that he would speak, and they gathered, farmers with calloused hands, women holding babies, the sick limping on weak legs, and even the curious wanting to see the men from Nazareth. They sat on the grass, crowding under the shade of olive trees, eyes fixed on Jesus. He stood there, his rough cloak fluttering in the wind, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, not with arrogance, but with deep love, like a father looking at his children. The disciples sat near him, Peter frowning in curiosity, John tilting his head to listen, while Andrew and James remained silent, waiting. Jesus raised his hand, and the crowd held its breath. Then he began to speak, his voice warm yet resonating, like water flowing over rocks, piercing the vast space. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he said, "for the kingdom of heaven is theirs." The crowd stirred, some whispering to one another. The poor, the despised in society, were called blessed. Jesus continued, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." His words were not like the dry laws of the scribes, but like a poem, a promise, a light shining into the dark corners of the human heart. He went on, his voice growing stronger, "You have heard that it was said, 'An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.' But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek. Love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you." A man in the crowd shouted, "How can we love our enemies?" Jesus looked at him, his gaze gentle but resolute. "Because you are children of your Father in heaven, who causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good." The Sermon on the Mount. The disciples sat quietly, their hearts moved. Peter whispered to Andrew, "He speaks as if he wants to turn the world upside down." Andrew nodded without answering, but his eyes shone as though he had just discovered a new truth. Jesus continued, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." His words were not just teachings, they were a call for the crowd to live differently, to love differently, to trust differently. He spoke about prayer. "When you pray, do not babble like the pagans. Pray like this, 'Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name.'" The crowd repeated his words, and in that moment, the mountain seemed to tremble with the sound of their unified prayer, blending with the wind's whisper. But not everyone was captivated. A few Pharisees, standing far off under the shade of trees, frowned as they listened to every word. "He teaches as if he has authority over Moses' law," one whispered. "Who does he think he is to say, 'I tell you,' instead of quoting scripture?" They did not approach, but their eyes flashed with suspicion and hostility. Jesus knew they were there, but he did not stop. He continued, "Seek first the kingdom of heaven, and all these things will be added to you." as the sun climbed higher, Jesus finished his sermon. Anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. When the rain comes, the house will stand firm. He sat down, and the crowd erupted in whispers. They were amazed, not only by his words, but by the way he spoke, with authority, not like the scribes who relied on textbooks. A woman holding a child whispered, "He speaks as though he knows my soul." Another man nodded, "These are not the words of an ordinary man." The disciples gathered around Jesus as the crowd began to disperse. John asked, "Master, what do these words mean for us?" Jesus looked at him, smiling. "You will understand when the time comes." Peter, still confused, said, "You teach us to love our enemies, but what if they attack us?" Jesus replied, "Trust in the Father, and love will be stronger than the sword." News of the sermon spread quickly throughout Galilee and reached Jerusalem. The Pharisees there heard it, and their doubts turned into worry. "He gathers the crowds and teaches things against the law," one said. "We must keep an eye on him." But in Nazareth, Mary heard the news from travelers. She knelt down, smiling through her tears. "My son is doing the will of the Father in heaven." Under the sky of Galilee, Jesus stood on the mountain, watching the crowd leave. He knew his words had sown a seed, the seed of hope, of change, of the kingdom of heaven. But he also knew that not everyone was ready to receive it. The disciples stood beside him, their hearts full of questions, but also full of faith. They didn't understand everything, but they believed in the teacher who had called them from the shores, and now was leading them on a path that the whole world would follow. By now, Jesus' fame had spread far beyond Galilee, reaching Judea and distant lands. People gathered around him, not only to hear his teachings or witness miracles, but to find hope in a world full of darkness. The disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, followed him, their hearts filled with both faith and questions. They had seen him turn water into wine. But each day with him brought new surprises. One evening, as the sun began to set over Capernaum, a bustling town by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus walked through the dirt streets, his disciples following behind. Shouting rose from the distance, mixed with cries and pleas. "Jesus! Jesus!" they called, pushing their way toward him. The disciples tried to keep them back, Peter growling, "Step back, let the Master rest." But Jesus raised his hand, his gaze gentle yet firm. "Let them come," he said. "I did not come to rest, but to serve." In the crowd, a man slowly made his way forward. He was gaunt, pale, his hands trembling from leprosy, the disease that caused him to be cast out and considered unclean according to Jewish law. The crowd recoiled, some covering their noses, but he did not stop. He knelt before Jesus, his voice hoarse, "Master, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus looked at him, not with disgust like the others, but with deep compassion. He bent down and placed his hand on the man's shoulder, a gesture that made the crowd shudder, for anyone who touched a leper was considered unclean. "I am willing," Jesus said, his voice warm but full of authority. "Be clean." Immediately, the man's skin changed, the sores disappeared, his complexion returned to healthy pink, and his hands stopped trembling. He looked up, tears running down his face, then shouted, "I'm healed." The crowd erupted in cheers, some knelt, while others ran off to tell the story. The men hugged Jesus' feet, but Jesus helped him up. "Don't tell anyone," he instructed. "Go, present yourself to the priest and offer the gift as Moses commanded." But the men couldn't keep silent. Who could, when the darkness of his life had just been driven away? Before they could leave Capernaum, another woman pushed her way through the crowd. She was small and frail, her eyes clouded from being blind since birth. Her son led her forward, his voice trembling. "Master, my mother has been blind since birth. Can you help her?" Jesus looked at the woman, his gaze seeming to pierce through her darkness. He spat on the ground, mixed the spit into mud, and placed it on her eyes. "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," he said. She obeyed, led by her son, and when she washed off the mud, her eyes opened. For the first time in her life, she saw light. She saw her son's face. She cried out, laughing and weeping, and the crowd buzzed. "The blind man can see. Jesus has done what no one else can do." The light in the darkness, the disciples stood in silence. Their hearts moved. John whispered to James, "He has authority over even disease." James nodded, but Peter frowned. "Why doesn't he let everyone know? They need to see this power." Jesus turned to him, smiling. "It's not power they need to see, but the love of my Father," he replied. Peter didn't fully understand, but he remained silent, believing that his master had a reason. News of the miracles spread quickly, and soon, an even larger crowd gathered in Capernaum. Among them was a man possessed by a demon, his eyes bloodshot, frothing at the mouth, his limbs convulsing. The people shrank back in fear, but Jesus walked forward without hesitation. "Come out of him," he commanded, his voice like thunder echoing through the air. A terrifying scream erupted from the man's mouth, then he fell to the ground, motionless. When he regained consciousness, his eyes were clear, and he knelt before Jesus, whispering, "Thank you. I am free." The crowd was amazed, but not everyone was joyful. A group of Pharisees from Jerusalem had arrived in Capernaum and were observing from a distance. They whispered among themselves, "He heals the sick, casts out demons, but by what power? Is he in league with the demon prince Beelzebul?" Another man shook his head. "No, look at the crowd, they believe he's a prophet. This is more dangerous than we thought." They did not dare confront him directly, but their eyes flashed with hostility. In Nazareth, Mary heard the news from passing travelers. She smiled, kneeling in prayer, "My son is bringing light to the world." But in her heart, a fleeting concern passed through her. The brighter the light, the darker the shadows. That evening, after the crowd had dispersed, Jesus led the disciples to the shores of Galilee. He sat down, gazing at the sparkling lake beneath the moonlight. "What did you see today?" he asked. Andrew answered, "You healed those no one else could heal." Jesus nodded. "It is not I who heal, but my Father works through me. You too will do these things if you believe." The disciples sat in silence, their hearts filled with questions, but also with faith. They did not fully understand, but they knew this teacher not only had authority over fish, wine, and words, but also over disease and darkness. Under the sky of Galilee, Jesus looked far off, knowing that each miracle was a step closer to the cross, but he was undeterred. His light had shone, and nothing could extinguish it. Walking on the waves, by now, the fame of Jesus had spread far beyond Galilee. The news reached Jerusalem, reaching the ears of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, those who guarded the law of Moses as if it were their own life. They heard about him, the man from Nazareth, the one who healed the sick, cast out demons, turned water into wine, and now gathered crowds with his strange teachings. Their doubt had turned into fear that Jesus was not just a prophet, but a threat to the power and order they had built over the centuries. One evening, after teaching thousands by the shores of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus looked at the crowd with compassion. They had been there all day, without food, and he did not want them to leave in hunger. He told his disciples, "Give them something to eat." Peter frowned, pointing to the crowd. "Master, "We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. How could that be enough for all these people?" But Jesus smiled, took the bread and fish from Andrew's hands, looked up to heaven and prayed, then began to break them. Right before the eyes of the disciples and the crowd, the bread and fish multiplied, enough to feed 5,000 people. With 12 baskets left over, the crowd cheered, calling him the great prophet. But Jesus knew their hearts. They wanted him to be an earthly king, to lead them against Rome. That was not why he had come. He told his disciples, "Go ahead, get into the boat and go to the other side. I will meet you there." Then he withdrew to the nearby mountain to pray alone under the darkening sky. The disciples obeyed, pushing the boat into the Sea of Galilee, but their hearts were still full of questions. What will he do next? Night fell, and suddenly a storm hit. The wind howled, and the waves battered the boat, causing it to rock violently. The disciples, seasoned fishermen, fought with the oars, but the boat couldn't move forward. Peter shouted over the wind, "We're going to sink." John gripped the rope, his face pale, while Andrew and James struggled to keep their balance as water poured over the sides. They had forgotten Jesus, forgotten the miracles he had performed, and were left with nothing but raw fear before the storm. Then, amidst the darkness and the storm, a figure appeared. Not on another boat, not swimming through the water, but walking on the surface of the Sea of Galilee as if it were dry land. The disciples screamed in terror, "A ghost! It's a ghost!" They recoiled, their hands trembling, but Jesus' voice rang out, cutting through the wind, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." His voice was not loud, but powerful, like a lighthouse in the storm, walking on the waves. Peter, though frightened, stood up, his eyes wide as he looked at Jesus. "Master, if it is really you, tell me to come to you on the water," he shouted. Jesus smiled and raised his hand. "Come," he said. Peter stepped out, placing his foot on the waves, and miraculously, he did not sink. He walked a few steps, his eyes fixed firmly on Jesus, and his heart was filled with intense faith. But then the wind grew stronger. The waves crashed against his feet, and he looked down. His faith wavered, fear rose, and he began to sink. "Master, save me," he cried out. Jesus immediately stepped forward, grabbed Peter's hand, and pulled him up. "You of little faith," he said, his voice both reproachful and gentle. "Why did you doubt?" He led Peter back to the boat, and as both stepped in, the wind ceased, the waves calmed, as if nature itself bowed before him. The disciples knelt, water dripping from their hair and clothes, whispering, "Truly, you are the Son of God." They had seen miracles before, but this time, they felt it, not just his power, but his authority over heaven and earth. As dawn broke, the boat reached the other shore of Galilee. The people there heard about the storm and the miracle, and they gathered, amazed at what the disciples had shared. But Jesus did not stay to receive praise. He led the disciples onward, his gaze distant, knowing that each miracle was one step closer to the greatest challenge ahead. In Jerusalem, the Pharisees heard about Jesus walking on water. "He's performing magic tricks to deceive the people," one said, with contempt. But another remained silent, his eyes filled with concern. "If he has power over the sea, where does his power come from?" They did not dare confront him directly, but their plan to oppose him began to take shape in the shadows. In Nazareth, Mary sensed something in her heart. She didn't know exactly what had happened on the Sea of Galilee, but she knelt and prayed, and a refreshing breeze blew through, as if to confirm that Jesus was safe. She smiled and whispered, "My son is doing the will of his Father in heaven." Under the sky of Galilee, Jesus walked, the disciples following behind. Peter was still trembling, but his heart had changed. he no longer just believed Jesus was the teacher, but the one who had authority over life and death. The other disciples looked at him with renewed awe, knowing that the one they followed was not just a prophet, but the light that nothing could extinguish. And in the stillness after the storm, Jesus looked at them, smiling, ready for the days ahead, days of miracles, conflict, and love that would overcome all. Confrontation in the sunlight, Jesus' fame now extended far beyond Galilee. News reached even Jerusalem, to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, those who guarded the law of Moses as if it were their very life. They heard about him, the man from Nazareth, the one who healed the sick, cast out demons, walked on water, and now gathered crowds with his strange teachings. Their doubts had turned into fear, the fear that Jesus was not just a prophet but a threat to the power and order they had built over centuries. Jesus, along with his disciples, continued his journey through Galilee. He didn't seek out the crowds, but the crowds sought him. One day, when the sun was high over Capernaum, he sat under an olive tree, teaching hundreds who gathered around him. The disciples stood close by, Peter still carrying the look of amazement from the miracle on the sea, John memorizing every word he spoke, while Andrew and James watched the crowd with growing caution. Jesus spoke of the kingdom of God, of mercy and forgiveness, words like a cool breeze passing through the crowd, but like a dagger in the hearts of those who didn't want to hear. In the middle of his sermon, a group of people appeared from a distance. They wore long, clean robes, carrying intricately carved wooden staffs, the mark of the Pharisees from Jerusalem. The crowd murmured, stepping back to make way. But Jesus didn't stop. He continued, his voice deep and steady, "Love your enemies, for if you love only those who love you, what are you doing more than others?" The Pharisees paused, standing in a row before him, their eyes cold as stone. The leader, an older Pharisee named Nicodemus, stepped forward. He was tall and thin, with silver hair, his voice sharp as a knife. "Jesus of Nazareth, we have heard that you teach the people things that contradict the law of Moses. You say they don't need to keep the Sabbath, don't need to wash their hands before eating. Who are you to change the law of God?" The crowd fell silent, a tense atmosphere enveloping the air. The disciples watched Jesus, waiting for his response. Jesus stood up, his eyes locking with Nicodemus, unafraid. "I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it," he said, his voice echoing through the space. "But you have turned the law into a burden, using it to oppress the people instead of leading them to my Father. The Sabbath was made for men, not men for the Sabbath." Nicodemus furrowed his brow, but before he could rebut, Jesus pointed to a man in the crowd, a man whose hand had been withered since birth, twisted like a dry branch. "Today is the Sabbath," Jesus called out, so everyone could hear. "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do evil on this day?" The Pharisees were silent, their eyes flashing with anger. Jesus walked over to the man, placing his hand on his shriveled arm. "Stretch out your hand," he said. The man trembled but obeyed, and before everyone's eyes, his hand straightened and became healthy, as though it had never been deformed. The crowd erupted in cheers, but the Pharisees turned away, whispering to one another, "He performed a miracle on the Sabbath. This is proof that he is against the law." Confrontation under the sun. From that day forward, the confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees became evident. They followed him throughout Galilee, trying to trap him with tricky questions. One time, at the synagogue in Capernaum, they asked, "Who do you say you are? A prophet or the Messiah?" Jesus answered, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness." His words astonished the crowd, but the Pharisees scoffed, "You call yourself the light. You are just the son of a carpenter from Nazareth." Jesus did not argue but looked at them with piercing eyes, as if seeing the dark thoughts within them. Tension escalated as Jesus continued performing miracles. One day, near Bethsaida, a father brought his son, who was possessed by a demon, before him. The boy collapsed on the ground, foaming at the mouth, eyes rolled back. The father kneeled down. "Master, I begged your disciples, but they could not cast out the demon." The disciples bowed their heads, ashamed, and Peter whispered, "We tried, Master." Jesus sighed, "O faithless and perverse generation, bring the boy to me." He stood before the boy, his eyes shining brightly. "O mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." A terrifying shriek filled the air. The boy convulsed violently, then lay still. The crowd thought he was dead, but Jesus took his hand and lifted him up. The boy opened his eyes, smiled at his father, and the father embraced him, crying out, "Thank you. You've healed my son." The crowd erupted in cheers, but the Pharisees stood off to the side, whispering, "He casts out demons by the power of Beelzebul. He must be condemned." But Jesus was undeterred by the slander. He turned to them, his voice like thunder, "If I cast out demons by the power of Beelzebul, then his kingdom is divided. How can Satan drive out Satan? But if I drive out demons by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you." His words silenced the Pharisees, but in their hearts, the plan to destroy him became clearer. In the days that followed, Jesus continued to teach and heal. In a small village, he encountered a woman who had been suffering from bleeding for 12 years, an ailment that made her unclean and an outcast in society. She pushed through the crowd, thinking to herself, "If I just touch his garment, I will be healed." When her hand brushed his cloak, a surge of power passed through her, the bleeding stopped, and her body was restored. Jesus paused and turned around. "Who touched me?" Peter, surprised, said, "Master, the crowd is pressing in on you. How can you ask who touched you?" But Jesus replied, "I felt power go out of me." The woman tremblingly stepped forward, kneeling, "Master, it was I. I have been healed." Jesus helped her to her feet, his gaze gentle, "Your faith has healed you. Go in peace." The crowd cheered, but the Pharisees whispered, "He broke the law, letting an unclean woman touch him." The confrontation went beyond words. One evening, in the synagogue in Nazareth, Jesus returned to his hometown. He stood and read from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor." Then he said, "Today this scripture is fulfilled." The people of the village, who had known him as the son of Joseph, murmured, "Who does he think he is?" One man shouted, "Isn't this the carpenter's son?" They became enraged, dragging him out of the synagogue, intending to throw him off a cliff. But Jesus passed through the crowd, his gaze making them freeze, and he went on his way, in peace. The call from the dead. By now, Jesus' fame had spread far beyond Galilee, reaching Judea and even the limestone walls of Jerusalem. People gathered around him, bringing with them hope, pain, and even doubt. His disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, John, and the newly chosen like Philip, Bartholomew, and Thomas, followed him, their hearts filled with faith yet challenged by the things they witnessed. The Pharisees and teachers of the law, who had once doubted, now openly opposed him, conspiring to destroy him. But Jesus remained undaunted. He walked, bringing light to the darkest corners of humanity. One day, as the sun rose over the hills of Judea, Jesus and his disciples passed through a small village near Jericho. The crowd had gathered along the dirt road, pressing together. Among them, a blind man named Bartimaeus sat by the roadside, ragged clothes on his body, holding a wooden staff. Hearing the footsteps and whispers, he shouted, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The people rebuked him, telling him to be quiet, but he shouted all the louder, "Have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and turned. "Call him to me," he said to his disciples. Peter and Andrew helped Bartimaeus to his feet and led him to Jesus. "What do you want?" Jesus asked gently. "Master, I want to see," Bartimaeus replied, his voice trembling. Jesus placed his hands on his eyes and said, "Go, your faith has healed you." Immediately, Bartimaeus' cloudy eyes were opened. He could see the sunlight, the face of Jesus, and the crowd around him. He knelt down, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Lord." Then he stood up, followed Jesus, and joined the crowd, who cheered. This miracle was only the beginning. As they reached Jericho, a small man named Zacchaeus, hated by the people as a tax collector, climbed up a sycamore tree to see Jesus. Jesus looked up, called to him, "Zacchaeus, come down. I must stay at your house today." The crowd murmured, "He's a sinner, why would the master go to his house?" But Zacchaeus, moved by Jesus' gaze, stood among the crowd and declared, "Lord, I will give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have wronged anyone, I will pay them back 4 times the amount." Jesus smiled. "Today, salvation has come to this house." These miracles only heightened the crowd's fervor, but also made the Pharisees in Jerusalem increasingly anxious. They sent people to follow him, recording every word he said and every action he took, waiting for the opportunity to accuse him. The journey continued, and one day, while Jesus was on the other side of the Jordan River, a messenger ran to him, sweating profusely. "Master," he said, breathlessly, "Lazarus, your friend, is very sick. Martha and Mary are pleading for you to come to Bethany immediately." The disciples looked at Jesus, waiting. Lazarus, Martha, and Mary were close friends of his. He had stayed at their home, taught them, and Martha had once busied herself preparing meals while Mary sat at his feet, but Jesus didn't hurry. He told his disciples, "This sickness will not end in death, but is for the glory of God so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Then he stayed 2 more days, causing Thomas, the doubter, to whisper to Philip, "If Lazarus dies, what will the people think of the Master?" Jesus overheard and turned to them, saying, "Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going to wake him up." The disciples thought he was talking about normal sleep, but Peter frowned and said, "Master, if he is sleeping, he will get better. Why do we need to go?" Jesus looked at them and said, "Lazarus is dead. But for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe." He led them to Bethany, just a few miles from Jerusalem. When they arrived, a crowd had gathered around Martha and Mary's house, weeping and wailing. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days and was buried in a tomb, with the smell of death beginning to spread. Martha ran out to meet Jesus, tears streaming down her face. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus took her hand and said, "Your brother will rise again." Martha replied, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." But Jesus looked deeply into her eyes and said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. Do you believe this?" Martha nodded, her heart trembling with a flicker of hope. Mary also came, fell at Jesus' feet, and wept bitterly. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus looked at her, and then at the weeping crowd, his heart filled with emotion. Tears fell from his eyes, not out of despair, but out of love and empathy for their pain. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. They led him to the tomb, where a large stone blocked the entrance. The disciples stood behind, anxious. Philip whispered, "Master, what are you going to do? He's been dead for 4 days." Jesus didn't answer, he just commanded, "Take away the stone." Martha objected, "Lord, by now there's a bad odor." But Jesus looked at her and said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" They did as he said and rolled away the stone, revealing the darkness inside the tomb. After Lazarus' resurrection, Jesus lifted his eyes to heaven, his voice resonating, "Father, I thank you for hearing me. I know you always hear me, but I say this for the benefit of the crowd standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." Then he shouted loudly, "Lazarus, come out." The crowd held their breath, the disciples widened their eyes, while the Pharisees, some of whom had come to observe, stood still, filled with doubt. From the darkness, a figure appeared. Lazarus walked out, still wrapped in burial cloths, his hands and feet bound. The crowd screamed in horror, then erupted in joyous shouting. "Unbind him," Jesus commanded. And Martha and Mary rushed to remove the cloths from Lazarus. He stood there, alive again, his eyes filled with life, and embraced his 2 sisters. The crowd knelt, shouting, "Jesus is the Son of God." But the Pharisees stepped back, their faces pale. The news of Lazarus' resurrection spread quickly, like wildfire, even reaching the Sanhedrin Council in Jerusalem. The Pharisees and the priests gathered, the atmosphere heavy with tension. Caiaphas, the high priest, stood up, "Do you not see? He performs such miracles, and the people will believe him to be the Messiah. If we let him continue, the Romans will come and destroy the temple and our nation." Nicodemus objected, "Can we condemn someone without a trial?" But Caiaphas shouted, "Better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish." From that day on, they were determined to kill Jesus. Jesus knew this, but he did not flee. He led the disciples to Ephraim, a secluded area, to prepare for the final days. One night, under the starry sky, he sat with them, saying, "I will be handed over to men, but do not fear. I will rise again." Thomas frowned, "Master, how can we let you die?" Jesus replied, "This is the will of my Father, and it is out of love for you, in Nazareth." Mary heard the news about Lazarus. She knelt and prayed, "Father, please guide my son through this darkness." The wind blew, bringing a refreshing breeze, but in her heart, a great worry grew. Riding the donkey into the holy city, the event of Lazarus' resurrection had shaken all of Judea, making Jesus' name spread farther than ever before. The people called him the Messiah, Son of David, and the great prophet, while the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin viewed him as the greatest threat to their power. Jesus knew his time on earth was running out, but he did not shrink from it. He led his disciples from Ephraim, through rugged dirt roads, toward Jerusalem, the holy city, where his destiny would be decided. Before entering Jerusalem, Jesus stopped in Bethany, where Lazarus, Martha, and Mary lived. People from all around gathered, not only to see Jesus but also to look at Lazarus, the one who had been dead for 4 days and now was alive again. Lazarus sat beside Jesus, his eyes glowing with life, recounting to the crowd about the darkness of death and how Jesus' voice had called him back. Martha was busy preparing food, while Mary knelt at his feet, anointing them with precious perfume, then wiping them with her hair. The fragrance filled the house, sweet and pure. Judas Iscariot, a newly chosen disciple, the keeper of the money bag, furrowed his brow and said, "Why wasn't this oil sold for 300 silver coins and given to the poor?" But Jesus looked at him, his voice calm, "Leave her alone. She has kept it for the day of my burial. The poor you will always have with you, but I will not be with you much longer." The other disciples remained silent, not fully understanding, but Mary looked up, tears streaming down her face. She sensed something that they had not yet seen. That evening, Jesus sat with his disciples and the family of Lazarus under the sky of Bethany. He said, "Tomorrow, we will go to Jerusalem. You will see what my Father has planned." Peter, always impulsive, asked, "Master, will the people crown you king?" Jesus smiled sadly, "My kingdom is not of this world." Thomas whispered to Philip, "What is he saying?" But they didn't ask any further, trusting that he had his reasons. The next morning, Jesus and his disciples left Bethany, passing through the Mount of Olives. As they neared Jerusalem, he stopped and pointed to a small village. "Go there, and you will find a donkey tied up. Untie it and bring it here." James and John followed his instructions, and when they brought the donkey back, the villagers asked, "What are you doing?" They replied, "Our master needs it," and no one stopped them, as if Jesus' words had paved the way. The disciples placed their cloaks on the donkey's back and helped Jesus onto it. He rode the donkey, not a war horse or a majestic chariot, but a humble, small animal, just as the prophet Zechariah had foretold. "Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion, shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly, and riding on a donkey." As he descended the Mount of Olives, crowds from Jerusalem and the surrounding areas gathered, waving palm branches and laying cloaks on the road. They shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The disciples walked beside him, Peter laughing loudly, "Master, they love you." But Jesus looked at the city ahead, tears running down his face. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem," he whispered, "if you only knew what would bring you peace. But now it is hidden from your eyes." He saw the future, not just today, but the day when this city would be destroyed for rejecting him. The Pharisees stood among the crowd, their faces dark with anger. One shouted, "Tell your disciples to be quiet." Jesus replied, "I tell you, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." His words enraged them, but they didn't dare take action amid the jubilant crowd. Jesus entered Jerusalem, leading his disciples to the temple, the holiest place for the Jewish people. But what he saw before him was not prayer or worship, but a bustling marketplace. People were buying and selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the sound of coins clinking filled the air as money changers counted their profits. Jesus stopped, his eyes blazing with a rare anger. He fashioned a whip from cords, struck the tables, overturned the money changers' booths, and shouted, "My Father's house is to be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." The crowd was astonished, the merchants fled, and money scattered across the floor. The disciples stood in silence. Peter whispered, "Master, you are truly angry." But the children in the temple shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David." The Pharisees approached, growling, "Do you hear what they are saying?" Jesus replied, "Yes. Have you never read, 'From the lips of children and infants, you have ordained praise'?" They could not refute him, but their hearts filled with even more hatred. Afterward, Jesus sat in the temple courtyard, teaching the crowds. He healed the blind and the lame right there. A paralyzed man was carried in on a mat, and he stood and walked when Jesus said, "Get up and walk." The crowd erupted in cheers, but the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin watched from a distance, their hearts boiling. They knew that with every miracle and every word he spoke, their power was being slowly chipped away. The Last Supper, after entering Jerusalem, Jesus knew his time was short. He led his disciples to a small house in the city, where the host had prepared an upper room for them to celebrate the Passover. That evening, under the dim light of an oil lamp, Jesus sat with the 12 disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot. The atmosphere was heavy. Despite the aroma of unleavened bread and roasted lamb filling the room, Jesus stood up, took off his outer garment, and took a basin of water and a towel. Then he knelt down and began washing the disciples' feet. Peter objected, "Master, why do you wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Peter was silent, allowing him to do so, his heart moved by the humility of his master. After he finished washing their feet, Jesus said, "I have set an example for you. You should love and serve one another as I have done." He sat back down, took the bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup of wine, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The disciples followed his instructions, but their hearts were troubled. Jesus looked at them, his voice low, "Truly, one of you will betray me." They looked at each other, horrified. John, sitting closest to him, whispered, "Who is it, Master?" Jesus replied, "It is the one I give this piece of bread to." He dipped a piece of bread and gave it to Judas. Judas took it, his eyes darkening. Jesus quietly said, "What you are about to do, do quickly." Judas stood up, left the room, and walked into the darkness. The disciples didn't fully understand, thinking he was going to buy something for the feast. But Jesus knew, he knew everything. He turned to them, his voice gentle, "I am leaving you a new command. Love one another as I have loved you. I am going, but I will return. Do not be afraid." Peter stood up, "Master, I will follow you even to death." Jesus looked at him sadly. "Peter, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Peter shook his head, but Jesus only smiled, not rebuking him. The Garden of Gethsemane. After the supper, Jesus took his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. The night was dark, the air cold, and the sound of insects buzzing filled the silence. He told them, "Sit here while I go and pray." He took Peter, James, and John further, then knelt down, sweating drops of blood as he prayed, "Father, if it is possible, take this cup from me. Yet, not as I will, but as you will." He returned and found the disciples asleep from exhaustion. "Could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked, his voice sad. They woke up, but their eyes were heavy. He went back to pray, and when he returned for the 3rd time, they were still asleep. "Get up," he said, "the hour has come." Suddenly, torches flickered in the darkness. Judas arrived with a crowd of soldiers and Pharisees, and kissed Jesus on the cheek, a sign to arrest him. Peter drew his sword and struck a servant, cutting off his ear, but Jesus stopped him. "Put your sword back. Do you not think I could call on my Father to send 12 legions of angels? But it must happen this way." He healed the servant's ear and allowed himself to be arrested. The disciples fled in panic, leaving only John and a few others who watched from a distance. Trial before Pilate. Jesus was bound and taken to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. The Pharisees and Sanhedrin accused him. He claims to be the Son of God. He must die. They beat him, spat on him, but he remained silent. The next morning, he was brought before Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "My kingdom is not of this world. Pilate was amazed at his calmness, but the crowd, stirred by the Pharisees, shouted, "Crucify him!" Pilate washed his hands, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood." He released Barabbas as customary, and Jesus was beaten by Roman soldiers, crowned with thorns, clothed in a purple robe, and then led away to be crucified. Mary stood in the crowd, tears rolling down her face, but she did not fall apart, believing that the Father's will was being fulfilled. The cross, on the hill of Golgotha, Jesus was nailed to the cross, his hands and feet pierced. He hung there between two criminals, his blood flowing onto the dry earth. The crowd mocked him, saying, "If you are the Son of God, why don't you save yourself?" But Jesus prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." John and Mary stood at the foot of the cross, their hearts broken. Jesus looked at his mother and said to John, "Here is your mother." Then he looked to heaven and declared, "It is finished." He bowed his head and breathed his last. The earth shook, the sky turned dark, and the curtain in the temple was torn in two. A Roman soldier whispered, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Resurrection in the light. 3 days later, Mary Magdalene went to Jesus' tomb at dawn and found the stone rolled away and the tomb empty. An angel appeared and said, "He has risen, just as he said." She ran to tell the disciples. Peter and John went to check, their hearts filled with belief. Jesus appeared to them. The wounds on his hands and feet still visible, but he was alive. "Peace be with you," he said. They fell to the ground, tears of joy streaming down their faces. He stayed with them for 40 days, teaching them about the kingdom of God, then ascended to heaven, promising, "I am with you always, to the very end of the age," eternal legacy. From that day on, the disciples spread the gospel of Jesus throughout the world. His light, which he had sown, surpassed the darkness, reaching every soul that was ready to receive it. Mary lived her final days in prayer, her heart at peace knowing her son had fulfilled the will of the Father. In the sky over Bethlehem, the star that once shone brightly had faded. But the light of Jesus, the light beyond darkness, continued to burn forever, never fading.